I would like to go back to something you said. You mentioned that as the temperature goes up and the Arctic melts, that we have this methane time bomb, so that not only is it getting warmer and climate change is increasing, but as it melts this Arctic, that this methane, which is more negative than carbon dioxide, is going to then pour out. So is this something that's far into the future? Is this, because it sounds like that would accelerate this and make it almost like you're saying there's a fire that's burning wet leaves very slowly and it's about to come to the very dry leaves. So is this methane time bomb a big concern, or how should we think about this?
It's a huge concern, and unfortunately, like the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet, which I want to talk about for a moment, both those things are the ticking time bombs that we can't quantify. We don't know how the Antarctic ice sheet is going to collapse, which is the biggest cause of sea level and changing the planet's weather and so on, more than the Arctic at the North Pole. This is the Antarctic at the South Pole. I'm talking about the big island with the ice on it. But methane are two things we can't quantify. And you ask about time scale. Antarctica is going to have significant melting this century and worse the next. Methane, in geologic time, we don't know. We've never warmed this fast. We're warming hundreds of times faster than the last 500 million years. We can't responsibly predict how methane will come out. Geologic time, 5,000 years is very quick, is the problem. When we looked at it, when we've had methane megafarts, and by the way, the scientists do use that term.
It's a good word.
Talked about, when there was a methane megafart some 50 million years ago, and a big bulge came out, that it was still over thousands of years. But in the scale of geologic time, looking at going back 30 million years ago when there was no ice on the planet, okay, things have a different relative perspective. Our problem is 100 years is forever, right? But it's not when we think about 4 generations being 100 years and our kids and grandkids. It's not that far away, the end of the century. So to answer your question, Steve, we truly don't know how quickly and how much methane can come out of the ground, and that's really the big question mark in the climate change, because in all of the models, we know that it's the most catastrophic game changer, and we don't know whether it'll happen in 200 years or 2,000 years. Partly it depends on how warm we get, and that depends on how we make our energy, and it's a vicious cycle that one thing leads to another. So again, we have to do both things. We have to look at the risk to, say, adapt, and also use it as the motivation to, say, slow the warming as quickly as possible by going solar and doing all these other things, getting population under control. But we've got to be realistic about it. People say, don't you get depressed by it? And I say, well, I get depressed by getting older too. But there's no choice to that. And it's important to keep my sense of humor, as you all do, and I'm glad you laughed for a moment. But the fact is that some of this is locked in. It's going to be our biggest test, and I really do think, I find a way to say the glass half full is this: we've never faced a challenge like this before. If anything is going to bring out the best in us in terms of technologic solutions, different attitudes religiously about population and things like that, and adaptation, which humans are really good at adapting, I do think that climate change has the opportunity to be the greatest teacher of all.
Well, I have to slightly disagree with you, because the Pentagon is planning for global warming, and they've got lots of battle plans. For instance, who's going to run and take over the Arctic and all its treasures within? Well, Shell apparently is going to drill in the Arctic's melting, so great, let's get in and get more oil to make it melt faster. But don't trust the Pentagon. They've got lots and lots of plans, and it's great for the weapons builders. And I kid you not, they've been writing about this for many many years.
I would actually turn that around. I would defend the Department of Defense in that they're actually some of the people at the forefront of recognizing
Well,
that this
I
is
know
a
they
major
are.
challenge that we
They
face.
are.
It's their job to secure
I was there
our
3
nation.
weeks ago, and talking to the head of the Coast Guard and so on, and talking about this. And
Coast Guard is in the Pentagon.
No, well, it's part of Homeland Security, and I was
Yeah.
also at the Pentagon. I was at both of them, Helen, okay? You're right that there are military issues, and the military people, as Seth said, the strategic planners in national defense get this. And they are not looking at it as an opportunity to sell more weapons. I'm sorry, that is not the case, okay? Certain defense contractors might be.
Well,
but
that's what I mean.
Okay, well, let's be honest here. The fact is that, to their credit, that the military, what they do, the quadrennial, every 4 years they have to do a whole defense review. And they have identified climate change as the biggest threat to national security this century. And it is black and white, and it is not something to be embraced or looked at as a positive opportunity for more weapons, okay? Quite the opposite. And there's an article in Rolling Stone in January, the Pentagon versus climate change, I think it was. And it was about the Congress trying to tie the hands of the Pentagon to not look at climate change. The strategists and the national defense people get it. I can tell you that.
So the people at the oil companies, the scientists at Exxon and Shell and all these
So
other
why
companies,
are they-
they know very
why
well
are
what's
they
happening.
going ahead?
Well, because they have business interests that
Money.
are pushing against it.
Right.
Money is the root of all evil. It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And the Pentagon is one of the biggest users of fossil fuel in the world.
It's the
Okay.
biggest, actually.
It's
yeah,
the biggest.
yeah.
So, bugger them, excuse my French. We say that in Australia. It's not a swear word in Australia.
But they're also some of the most aggressive about looking at alternative energy
Yeah, I
because
know,
they are
but
such a large consumer
but,
of energy.
It's give cancer on the one hand and, cure it on the other. And the weapons makers actually help to run the Pentagon. I've written books about this. You know that, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and the like. That's why they like to have wars, like in the Ukraine and the Middle East. Because after the Cold War ended, they had no market for their weapons. Anyway.
So there's a bunch of people that are going to watch this on replay, they're watching on live stream, and some of them are going to say, yeah, I think I listened to a lot of that panel, and I think what I heard is this isn't something that we have to worry about for a few decades. And they're going to walk away, and they're going to ignore everything else and say, oh yeah, I can wait a few decades. So again, for the people who are walking away saying, oh, it sounds like we got a big problem, but we got 20, 30, 40 years to deal with it. There's Lester Brown, who writes all these environmental books, says, we're going to have water issues, we're going to have food issues, the environment is exasperating every one of them, we are messing with people's water supply and their food supply, the storms are going to be greater, there's going to be more bugs that can live in areas they weren't supposed to. So again, for everyone who's feeling cozy, like, we're okay, we got to figure this out, but we got 30, 40 years. Why do you want any of these people to care now? Why do they have to? They're figuring that Apple will figure out some solution, and why should people care now? How is this part of their lives in the next 10, 20, 30 years that?
It is happening. I mean, as I said, they just put in $15 million of pumps in Miami, the first phase of a $300 million plan to keep salt water off the streets every 28 days. Okay, they're not alone. I mean, people look at the Maldives and Tuvalu and Kiribati in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, but all over the world, coastal communities that are low-lying are flooding every 28 days when the tide is at peak height. Okay, that's happening now. People are getting concerned about their real estate values. But disease vectors are changing. The pine bark beetle has destroyed hundreds of millions of acres of lodgepole pine out in the Pacific Northwest and Colorado. The drought is probably a function of changing oceanic and atmospheric weather patterns. These things are associated with warming the planet. We are seeing the effects now, don't make no mistake. And I think to one of your earlier questions, Steve, the fact is that probably in the next decade, we are going to see more clarity about what's happening in Antarctica with the ice melting. And there's some glaciers down there that, back to the sea level, which is just one aspect of climate change, but it gets us our attention because sea level is something we've taken for granted as unchanging. And sea level affects the shoreline, which is different than storms, is why I use it. But we're probably going to have much greater clarity in the next decade about the rate of the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet. And that's going to have profound impacts for all coastal communities, and not just on the coast, of tidal rivers. Hartford, Connecticut, and Sacramento, California, and Washington, D.C. are not on the coast, but they're on tidal rivers. They're as much a threat as a coastal city. So I think it's happening now. This is the story of the century.
Yeah, I think part of it, it depends who you are. We, like myself, who live in a city, we're often sort of isolated from a lot of the effects that are happening right now with climate disruption. If you're a farmer, you're pretty well aware that we've got a problem already. We are having more droughts, longer droughts, more severe droughts, and also more floods, extreme rain events. We're getting, 100-year rains every 5 years or whatever it is. And both of those are bad for agriculture. The only way we see that is maybe on CNN, or our food prices might go up a little bit, which for those of us in the developed world doesn't matter so much. But this is we're insulated from it, but it's happening.
Yeah.
So once again, a medical analogy. I've caused quite a few people to stop smoking. They've been angry as hell with me. I've really frightened them, and they haven't forgiven me for 5 years, but they did stop smoking. Once again, it comes back to education, and I can't understand people who say, well, why should I bother? It's not going to be bad for 30 years. We're an amazing species with this huge cortex and the opposing thumb. Look what we've done to the planet. And how much do we value life? How much do we value our own life? How much do we value a rose or the lilac? Really, seriously. I had a man who came up to me after one of my talks and he said, I've got prostate cancer. He said, for the first time I've started smelling the roses because life is so precious. But really, we hold life on earth in the palms of our hands. And it's up to us, and we're very intelligent, whether we can save it or not. And isn't that the greatest challenge that we face? But also, it's quite wonderful because we can do it. Yes, there will be problems, but we actually, if we get on our bicycles and start going, we can actually do it. And that's how we think as doctors. We can save this patient. We'll stay up all night with them if necessary. We have to stay up all night fixing the mess that we've made for the planet, not just for our children and this species, but all other species and all the plants.
Yeah. To pick up on that real quickly, she hits on the right point that it's life on the planet that is a threat. The planet itself is going to be just fine.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing's going to happen to the planet, but we, plants and animals and other organisms that live on it, are the ones who are under threat.
Carl, many of us remember Carl Sagan, a really visionary astronomer who was very articulate and good at looking at the big picture. And he said the most exciting time to be alive was when we go from ignorance to understanding. And in astronomy or the universe or cosmology, that was in our era and his era. He died about 15 years ago, I think. And I think the same thing applies to humanity and our life and on the planet, as Helen and Seth just said. We didn't understand that there was a limit to population growth, that water resources and food resources and disease and all these things came together. We thought we could grow forever. And we're really now can quite clearly see that there's a limit to growth. And we can also see that as all cultures emulate Americans' consumption, as Helen aptly described, but as Seth brought up, the question of how do we produce enough energy for those people, particularly if we want to take nuclear off the table. That what does that mean for the medical aspects of what it does to us, whether it be heat issues, the acidification of the ocean. So in some ways, it's the most dire, scary time you could imagine, but I think you can also make the case for the opposite. That for the first time, environmentalism isn't some optional thing for the 10% who want to be tree huggers. This is where environmentalism hits mainstream. That if our water supplies change, and our food changes, and real estate goes underwater and some of our most valuable property, like the big California growing regions, are vulnerable to flooding, east of San Francisco, the San Fernando Valley. So This is the worst of times or the best of times. This may be the first time in 100 years that people have been concerned about environment where they said, you know what? This is an end game. We've really got to get this right. It's not a pretty picture, as you say, but the truth is, neither's getting older, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't make the most of it and take care of yourself, as I suspect all of you here are concerned about doing. Learning what we can, eating better, doing all those things for our bodies, but the truth is we've got to start applying that to the planet. And it means some tough choices about energy, about adapting to some things which are already locked in and in the pipeline. We should go solar and renewable energy in general. But this is either the worst of times or the best of times, and it's the teaching opportunity. I think you're both right. And we've really all got to look at that glass as half full. It's a really dire situation. Because if we let CO2 go to 900 parts per million, which is the latest projection of the IPCC, and the planet go 7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today, we're toast. So we've got to do two things. We've got to begin adaptation, make people realize what's at risk, and also work to mitigate, which I hate the term, slow the warming as quickly as possible, and realize that this is a different game. Or different, I shouldn't say game. This is a different challenge than we've ever faced before. Let's use it to our opportunity as a teaching opportunity.
So we have 6 minutes left. There's a lot of people that are willing to listen to this kind of information about every year or two. And this is their one time they're tuning in to listen. So I guess as a closing comment from each of you, people are going to see this. They're going to see this in the future. They're going to hear what you say. And a lot of people they listen to this. They're weighing it. Is there anything else you want to say to someone who's trying to decide whether they should care a lot about climate change and sea level rise and nuclear power and ocean acidification and deforestation and water shortages and overpopulation and species extinction? And they're kind of thinking, is this really a big deal or not a big deal? Is this something you want to say again, even if you've said it? You want to finalize your thoughts and say something?
We've done that.
I'll just say, if you don't care about this, what do you care about? This is as big a deal as it gets. This is life on Earth, right? That's what's at the stake here.
Yep, it's the biggest thing we've ever faced, ever.
It brings
If you
everything
love
together.
this planet, you'll get on and save it. And we can.
I think we've said it all. This really becomes the test at a different level. And no matter what our perspective is about how to make energy, how to get off nuclear, how to worry about sea level rise, there's a bigger picture here. It's really, what are humans capable of? We've proven what we can do technologically, but that's not going to stop the oceans from rising and the warmer temperatures from changing species and with ocean acidification changing the food chain in the ocean. We can wish all we want. We can get great apps on our phones and come up with neat technologies to put things in space. But this is an ecosystem, and we've really got to look at that technology. And the best, I use the ocean's sea level rise because it's physical. People get that ice melts at 32 degrees or 0 Celsius. You can't change that. It's a way of bringing this down to something really simple.
Or the alternative question is, are we an evolutionary aberrant?
Meaning?
We're not meant to survive. Are we an evolutionary aberrant? That's a question we need to ask ourselves.
Now, when the newspapers or the pro-business newspapers say that this is not a big deal or whatever, what are they not understanding about how it's going to affect them? We're talking about how it affects us individually, but for a business who's pro-business, they want low taxes, they don't want government interference, what are they not understanding about how it's going to affect them that's making them think that we don't have to care about this?
That's a really big and complex question, but the Zeroth Order simple answer to it is that they answer to quarterly reports, right?
Yep.
They have to satisfy shareholders 4 times a year that they're making money. And this is a problem that is a longer time scale than 3 months. And if our, I don't know how you even do that, I'm not an economist, but if we could restructure the way we even think about business to think about the longer time scale, because they will lose money in the long run, I guarantee you, that they're making decisions that they're going to lose them and everyone else money, but not in the next quarter, it's going to be years down the line.
I was going on the Fox Business Channel, and I embrace the most hostile audience because I think they're the people we need to change the opinions of, not the environmental liberal audience, if you will. So I welcome those opportunities. And in the green room, there was one of the most prominent climate deniers who gets paid by one of the big right-wing think tanks, if you will. He said, John, don't you know what it's going to cost for us to get off of coal as a cheap energy source? He said, do you know how expensive that's going to be? I said, boy, I guess I really never calculated that, Pat. Do you know what it's going to cost to move all of our coastal cities inland? And he just stopped. He hadn't thought of that either. It's how we frame things. I mean, there are economic arguments, and we tend to think in quarterly reports and profits and so on. We're not thinking of this big picture. And that's exactly what we have to begin to do. We'll get more into this. Helen's got a session tomorrow. I've got one about sea level rise, and I hope you all embrace
it. As a doctor, I actually treat some of these people who worry about their quarterly reports on their deathbed or when their children are dying. And they fall into my arms and they tell me all the wicked things they've done. They know. They all know. They've got a moral conscience, and when they're at the coalface of life and death, out comes their truth and their morality with which they were born, that purity of soul. Everybody has that purity of soul. That's what we must reach when we talk to people.
Now, in case anyone's worried, don't worry, because tomorrow night, on Sunday, we have Plan B 4.0, mobilizing to save civilization, the climate change, resource depletion, and environmental solution. So don't worry about anything you heard tonight. We're going to solve it all tomorrow night.